So obviously a success story there, gentlemen. But as we talked about before the break, though, Ken, I mean, if commercialization is the key to this, what do we need to do to bridge that gap to start getting these companies to market and really the bulk of the wealth here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Further investment needs to be put into these companies, but not necessarily by the government, as Dan pointed out before. This is where angels, VCs, private investment needs to be put in place based on the technology getting to a point where they can prototype and show it working. And there's a lot of investment that's been put to date in the intellectual property development and getting a product to a prototype stage. We now have to help them to get their products to market. So that involves 10 times the investment that's been made so far to get it to a point where you can actually sell it, go worldwide with it.
And speed, obviously. I mean, Steve, Microline, 25 years in the making before they got to a point that it's a $30 million company. I mean, obviously, we can't have all companies of that size in this industry taking that long, or certainly this goal of $20 billion will be much longer than 8 years.
I agree. I think you have to ask why it took that long. I think it was a nascent company in a novel industry sector. How can you accelerate? I think you have to identify the 3-4 critical elements to get from laboratory prototype scale to commercial, and what could you do to accelerate that? Building on Ken's comment with respect to the investments needed, unfortunately, nano and technology-intensive industries, you need a layer more than angel investors. A single product could be 10 to 25 million to develop, another 10 to 25 million to commercialize, and you got to start thinking at that level of dollars if you really want to play in this sector. And then the question is, where do those dollars come from? They don't need to come from government, but there is a role where government has to, whether it's through taxation or tax incentives or whatever, can play a role to facilitate the investment. And I think both provincially and federally, we don't quite have that in place right now.
Because there are certainly applications, you know, as we talked about in the break, for oil and gas, a sector that's huge. There's some big companies, some big players where the dollars that Steve is talking about are probably a lot more realistic. What do we need to do to get those big players, to get, you know, or whoever it is, to get involved in some of these efforts?
Well, first off, we have to ensure that we're making them aware of what we are able to do in Alberta, what our capabilities are, also what types of programs we have to help de-risk that activity, and then to be able to demonstrate exactly where the technologies we have can actually help solve some of the pressing problems that they have.
Okay, so they're not aware now? Is this a bit of an education campaign, would you say?
Well, a lot of the larger corporations are engaged in, for instance, oil exploration. So the companies that are involved locally in developing micro nanotechnologies can help in that. They need to understand that that's available for them. They don't have to go off and develop that technology themselves. It could have already been worked on and developed. So it's, there is a learning process, an education process for some of the larger corporations. They're not developing everything themselves, so they have to be looking outside to the intellectual property and developments that have been done in smaller corps.
And maybe it's also good to point out that a lot of these major corporations, the real large ones, are actually looking to the tier 1 suppliers, the technology providers, to actually provide them with those solutions. So one of the tactics is to make sure that we are engaging those tier 1 suppliers.
Okay, Steve, I just want your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think my build on it is more on oil is a mature industry. We're going to exploit it fully. Right. And the people in that space have the dollars to do everything they need. The other oil-rich jurisdictions of the world, Texas, Middle East, Russia, are looking at nano as a vehicle to diversification, a vehicle to post-oil. And to some degree, it is not to say there's no opportunities in nano for oil. By all means, let's do that. But we have to look beyond that. And to some, there's a major emphasis on NINT towards a development of a cluster of new technologies, new companies beyond oil. And I think very critical to the area.
And from Nano Alberta's perspective, we agree with that totally. We think that we can actually help support traditional industries while building new industries through nanotechnology.
I want to go around with sort of we'll pull out the crystal balls and look forward. I'll start with you, Ken.
Sure.
There are already some big players around the globe. What can we expect from Alberta 5-10 years down the road? What kind of impact will we feel, will Albertans feel, and could they feel if things are done right?
Actually, Another great question. If you look at Alberta, I came here, from the U.S. There's a lot of exciting technology developments going on here. Compared to the rest of the world, we can be very competitive. But I think, again, it does take some investment. We've invested a lot of money, a lot of time in technology creation. We now have to get to a point where we can take those products to market. Some of the biggest issues that are going forward with us are going to be how do we get through those channels to sell products. There isn't a lot of that here in Alberta, so we have to work through development of channel as well as getting the products to a point where they can sell into those channels. So the effort's not minimal. There's a large effort there, but it's doable. And I think to get companies to a point where they're 10 million in sales a year to 100 million in sales a year is not that hard for some of the technologies that are here in Alberta. Now, to $1 billion each, there's a questionable point there and how long it'll take to get to that point. But I think if you look back at Microline, your original question, Microline was evolving from a university type of a technology where companies were using them for contract manufacturing. They're now getting to be a product company, but it's taken them 25 years to get to a point where they're becoming a product company, right, where they're growing their own products. So what you saw from the video was an example of a product line manager actually developing products of his own to the market. And that's new for Microline.
And we need to see more of that.
Yes, exactly.
What do we need to see?
We need a bold initiative. We need something as bold as the carbon capture and sequestration. We need a $2 billion investment. Otherwise, we're not playing seriously.
Are you confident if we saw a $2 billion investment that the taxpayers of Alberta would recoup that investment through jobs and through a burgeoning industry that has some long-term viability in the province? Absolutely.
I think all of the major players in the world recognize that nano is a vehicle to an end, and a front-end $1 to $2 billion investment towards $20 billion 10 years from now, the economics actually start to make sense, right? The amount of investment and the return expected. But if we're playing in the single-digit $50 million cumulatively over 10 years, we're not going to get to $20 billion.
Dan, can you go ask for $2 billion?
Would love to.
Yeah, but it's an interesting point. I mean, there is that critical mass in a lot of industries where if you don't get that initial investment, you can throw 50 million, 100 million at it year over year and never get a recoup on that. Are you concerned about that?
Well, one of our tactics is to ensure that we are bringing along the federal government as a partner, and they have been very active with us, and also industry, because we know even that 130 million, at least if we could turn that $1 into $3, we're going a long way to reaching what we need to do, or at least having the capacity to do what we need to do to create this new, call it a sector.
Okay, great stuff. Thanks very much for coming in, gentlemen. Just a fascinating conversation. We'll certainly keep our eye on this going forward.
Thank you.
That's Dan Dukic, Acting Executive Director of Nano Alberta, Ken Brazell, CEO of ACAMP, and Steve Petroni, CEO and Chief Technology Officer of Quantum.